spotted a vehicle sitting in a field. He discovered a man in the driver's seat, slumped over the steering wheel. The man was unresponsive. He was bleeding from a wound in the back of his head. The security guard called 911.
Jefferson County 911, what is your emergency? A man in a field?
A dispatcher alerted units from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department.
7214, 6017.
Within minutes, paramedics and deputies were on the scene. But for the man who lay motionless in the driver's seat, it was too late. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area and called in crime scene investigators. Detective William McDaniel took charge of the case.
When I pulled up, there was a car partially off a gravel roadway, had a white male slumped at the wheel. The rear passenger side window was shattered. It looked like from a bullet.
The evidence suggested to Detective Michael Gray the car was moving when the man was shot.
When the vehicle was found, it was in gear. His foot was still on the brake pedal. We surmised that the vehicle was traveling at idle speed. We initially were looking at the possibility of it being hunting related simply because of the time of year. The area in question is known for a lot of hunting.
Detectives examined the car inside and out in search of any clues. Some 30 feet away on the dirt road, investigators found shards of glass. They believed the bullet struck the car and driver here, after which he drove straight off the road. The driver was removed from the vehicle and identified by his license. His name was Larry Holman, a 44-year-old from nearby Hillsboro. The victim's wife was contacted. Detective McDaniel knew the victim from around town. He was a church-going family man, not a man prone to have many enemies. He was also an avid hunter.
The security guard revealed that the subject was in the field area scouting for deer or possible hunting locations. It's the last day of deer season, and there have been reports of poachers on the property. The car is in a field where the deer cross, so there's chances somebody may have thought it was a deer moving across the field.
Detectives turned to forensics to find the source of the deadly shot.
Well, the important thing was to try to determine the direction the projectile came from. Once we got a direction, we'd have a line on where to search for any items of forensic evidence, any shell casings, items left behind. That's why it was important to try to position everything back in its original location. We repositioned the vehicle back on the road. We figured out a trajectory angle based upon the approximate head height of the gentleman. It was a matter of setting up a tripod, taking a trajectory string, and then just extrapolating back to the wooded area.
Holman had been shot from behind, the bullet passing through the window and the car's headrest before killing him.
Okay, that's good.
Police used this information to reconstruct the bullet's path.
We ran the trajectory angle back from the vehicle at about 40 to 50 feet away near the wood line. The trajectory string was at about shoulder height, which would be consistent with an individual taking aim or firing with a weapon.
Investigators scoured the woods in that area, looking for potential evidence left by a careless hunter. But police came up empty-handed. No shell casings, cigarette butts, or any clues to help explain what happened. The sheriff's deputy interviewed the security guard at the entrance to the property. He was the last person to see Larry Holman alive. Police hoped the guard might recall some small clue to find the killer. The guard had known the man. Larry had worked there and hunted on the property often. On the day of his death, Larry Larry Holman arrived alone and in good spirits. It was his day off work, and he told the guard he would be out in the field scouting for deer. According to a sign-in sheet,
Yes, sir, it is.
Holman had entered the property at 4:20 in the afternoon. He would never sign out.
Yes.
Police spoke with the victim's wife, Tammy, to see if she could shed any additional light on the investigation.
I don't understand.
She said she had last seen him the morning he was killed. The couple had been married nearly 15 years. She described her marriage as happy and could think of no one who wished Larry harm. She wasn't able to provide any additional information. An autopsy was performed, though it offered few clues that could point to a perpetrator. According to the coroner's report, Larry Holman died instantly. A high-velocity slug was retrieved from his skull, but it was unidentifiable. The bullet's lead core was gone. Only a mangled copper jacket survived. Investigators hope to recover more pieces of the bullet in the victim's car.
See if we can preserve that projectile. It had fragmented when it penetrated the glass. When we processed the vehicle, we found some fragments from projectile embedded in the headrest of the driver's seat. So we decided to retrieve that in the attempt to try to determine the caliber of the weapon and maybe the ammunition that was used.
At the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, forensics expert Todd Garrison was charged with putting the bullet back together again.
First, it hit a window of an automobile. Secondary impact was the headrest of the automobile. The third impact was the victim's head. Each one of those impacts contributing a little bit more to its damage and distortion.
Garrison analyzed the size and weight of the pieces.
One of the copper fragments out of the headrest had rifling engraving on it that was similar to the rifling engraving that was observed on the bullet out of the victim's head.
He determined that he was looking at pieces of a .243 caliber bullet.
Generally, the .243 Winchester caliber is associated with a hunting type rifle, as for deer, large game.
At the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, detectives formed a task force. If this was a hunting accident, it would be nearly impossible to solve. Thousands of hunters passed through the area. Detective Gray laid out what little they did know.
You have an individual who's what we term low risk. The guy's a family man. The guy had no known enemies. Did not live a lifestyle that would be conducive to violence.
Investigators, however, were not yet willing to declare the case an accident. Something didn't seem right.
Accidental shots usually end up somewhere else on the body. Headshots are usually an aimed shot. When you start thinking about the laws of probability, we have a moving target, small rear window, the thickness of the woods, it did not look like an accident.
Police officially labeled the death suspicious, but they had no leads to point them to the killer. It seemed the investigators had come to the end of their trail of evidence. Weeks turned into months, and no new clues surfaced. Police issued press releases throughout the small community, asking the public for help. By January, little headway had been made on the case. Then, police got a break from an unlikely source.
Hi.
Tammy Holman, the victim's widow, told investigators about a series of unsettling letters she had been receiving.
It's weird.
After her husband was shot, a man named Carter Davis began writing her love letters.
It's just kind of fishy.
Tammy said she had rebuffed him, but he would not leave her alone. She turned his letters over to police. I love you and won't let you go, read one. We're soulmates, read another. The detective's interview with Holman's widow left them with some questions.
Wouldn't say who he was. No, he wouldn't say who he was.
They knew that a man named Alan Tripp had moved in with her shortly after her husband was killed.
Mrs. Holman started to look suspicious to us. Her actions didn't really correspond with the grieving widow. We began to expand our investigation.
Detectives ran Tammy's name through the system. Her record was clean. But they also knew her name did appear on another significant document. Larry Holman's insurance policy offered a payout of $125,000. He had an additional policy of $2 million if he died in a hunting accident. The beneficiary was his wife. For detectives, what started as a simple accident was now looking like it might be cold-blooded murder.
Wow, is that really me?
What should be done across the nation in terms of shelter at home, but they're also asking him for more equipment, and they're very frustrated on both of those levels. And so you've seen a lot of governors say, well, we have to do this ourselves. We have to work together and take that on because we're not getting what we want from the federal government and from President Trump. Now, the president and vice president are going to continue to have these regular calls. They have at least a weekly call with all the governors. And so they're going to continue to try to coordinate it, but they're really at this back and forth impasse almost, where the governors are asking for things that they feel like they're not getting.
Robert Costa, people are hunkering down. People lucky enough to get out to the store and survive it are washing down the goods they buy when they get back to their kitchen, ideally. Give us a window into your reporting. Give us a window into Mitch McConnell's thinking right about now.
In a phone interview today, I spoke to Leader McConnell at length about how he sees upcoming congressional negotiations. Every American knows that the Congress passed a $2.2 trillion bill, an economic rescue package, last week. The president signed it into law. The question is, what's next? Speaker Pelosi has begun to outline some of her own ideas, things she would like to see included in the next round of negotiations. She's talked about direct mail voting. She's talked about reducing state and local tax caps. She's looking at an array of initiatives. In my interview,
Tail said that you can get rid of under-eye puffiness by rubbing raw egg whites or even hemorrhoid cream below your eyes. Well, that's just yucky. And we've tested it, and it didn't work.
Hi guys, my name is Sandy Marinese. I'm a professional hair and makeup artist, and one of the number one questions that I always get in my chair is
Keeping you informed, empowered, and secure. In doing so, the Be Safe initiative has featured fugitives across the country that have successfully been captured. If you have any information to the whereabouts of this individual, please call the number on your screen. We hope you may have the one tip, the one piece of information that will lead to their capture. In November 2000, Missouri deer hunter Larry Holman was found dead in a field. He'd been shot in the head with a .243 caliber bullet fired from a hunting rifle. At first, it appeared as if it was an accident, but police were beginning to have their doubts. They weren't the only ones. In January 2001, the victim's brother, Randy Holman, turned in a .243 Winchester bolt-action rifle. He knew the police were looking for that type of weapon and suspected Larry's death was no accident. Randy feared the killer was someone his brother knew, who may have used this gun to murder him.
You want that seat right there?
Jefferson County Detective William McDaniel.
We interviewed Randy Holman, brother of Larry Holman. He actually brought in a deer rifle of Larry's, and he wanted us to do a comparison of the deer rifle to the ballistic round, what was found at the crime scene.
At the time of the murder, the gun had been stored at the home of Larry and Tammy Holman. Randy had good reason to suspect his brother was murdered. He told police his brother Larry had been shot at before.
We were at my parents' place.
Days before his death, Larry had gone hunting deep in the Missouri woods.
Randy stated that he and Larry had a conversation later in the night after hunting. Larry stated that he had a close call, and Randy asked, "Well, what do you mean by a close call?" He goes, "Well, I had a bullet inside my head." Because there was so much gun activity up in the northern part of Missouri during deer season. And they kind of joked about it.
But now he knew it was no joke and wondered if Larry has been shot with his own gun.
Heavily hunted. Didn't think much about it.
He just wished that that gun would be ruled out so that way he knew the gun had no involvement into his brother's death.
Alan, thanks for coming by. Yes.
Investigators sent the gun to ballistics and began interviewing suspects. First on their list was Alan Tripp, the widow's new love interest.
You know what we want to talk to you about?
Tripp had grown up with Tammy Holman and came to her side shortly after Larry's death.
Oh, I've known her since grade school. We went to grade school.
Within the last couple months, Alan Tripp had moved in with Mrs. Holman and actually gave her an engagement ring. His actions raised some red flags with us. He stated he had no knowledge of the incident, that he had spoke to Mrs. Holman several times about the so-called accident, and she stated that there was nothing there.
Calling her all the time.
Investigators also sought out a local man named Carter Davis.
Yeah, he's right over there clearing that table.
Tammy said Davis had become infatuated with her, showering her with flowers and love letters.
I need to ask you some questions about it.
Letters that concerned Tammy Holman.
Oh.
Like Tripp, he insisted he had nothing to do with the crime.
Tammy and I are friends.
At one time, Carter Davis actually put a note on Alan Tripp's car which said, "Did you kill him?" And he just believed that Alan Tripp had something to do with his death.
Police had also gotten a very interesting lead. They learned that Tripp and Davis were not the only men close to Tammy Holman.
We received an anonymous phone call. It was a male subject.
The caller suggested they check out the alibi of a third man.
Was a male caller?
The tipster said Charles Miller had a gun similar to the one police were looking for. McDaniel checked Miller's record for any previous arrests. Miller had a record. He had been arrested for check fraud. A few days later, on January 9th, 2001, investigators caught another break.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat.
Nice to meet you.
A woman gave police new information on the case.
Some information I don't know if you can use.
She told Detective McDaniel that she lived near the field where Holman was shot. For several days leading up to the crime, she observed a suspicious-looking man with a gun walking near the crime scene. McDaniel showed the woman a lineup. She identified Charles Miller without hesitation.
Yeah, right there, actually.
Within hours, they had their man in sight. Charles Miller was arrested and brought in for questioning. He admitted he was a friend of the Holmans, but claimed to know nothing of the crime.
They had attended Sunday schools together. Miller would come over and do work around the Holman's house. He would bring eggs, he would bring, bacon, and so Tammy would cook breakfast in the morning for him and Larry.
Miller offered to cooperate with investigators.
Mr. Miller gave us permission to do a consent to search on firearms that he had owned. We were only looking for high-powered rifles. He actually gave us 3 rifles, one being a Browning Bolt A-Action 243.
Deputies also seized boxes of .243 caliber ammunition and cell phone records, which indicated that Miller had called the Holman residence on the day of the crime.
Once the gun was seized from Charlie Miller during the consent to search, it was delivered to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab in Jeff City for a ballistic match.
Criminalist Todd Garrison examined Miller's rifle, as well as Larry Holman's gun, brought in by his brother Randy.
I test fired both of the rifles in question. From those, I obtained bullets. which I could do microscopic comparisons between. I eliminated the .243 Winchester caliber Savage rifle.
The rifle taken from the victim's home was not involved. That left Charles Miller's gun. There were key similarities, but damage to the bullet recovered from the body prevented a 100% match.
But I did observe the rifle engraving and also isolated agreements of some individual characteristics. Not enough to say, yes, this firearm did fire this bullet, but enough that it was consistent with that particular firearm.
The forensics seemed to point squarely at Charles Miller. He was now their prime suspect. Miller, already in custody, was interrogated by Detective McDaniel.
He was not a very emotional person. He asked us questions if this was about his gun. We explained to him, yes, it was about his gun we seized. And he bowed his head and he looked back up and he said, I killed him. I killed him. It took us all for a shock. When we find out later, Mr. Miller was a very church-going person, and I believe this was eating him up inside. You know what kind of
Police now had a confession, but what Miller was about to tell them would blow the case wide open.
Cleaning the tub is a back-breaking chore. You scrub those dirty germs and bacteria by hand, but there's always more. Introducing the
can spread the coronavirus. Today he called that a revelation. With us tonight, Dr. Robert Gallo, director and co-founder of the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He's the co-founder of the Global Virus Network. He himself has
bacteria. Even clean those areas you couldn't normally reach. And we're not done yet. You'll also get this free soft flex comb brush that fits perfectly into corners. There's no easier way to get faucets.
how many people have coronavirus in our country presently and are so far behind the testing 8-ball, we are likely never to know. But having said that, what do you make of how the fight is going thus far?
Well, certainly the point you just made about not knowing the number of infections as well as you would want to know is a problem. And I think that is
800-615-9517.
Police had a suspect in custody, Charles Miller.
Charlie, you know why we're here?
And when presented with the forensic evidence, he confessed.
Right.
But the confession was only the beginning.
Charles Miller got, I guess, infatuated with Mrs. Holman. He stated to us that he always thought she was a very well-kept woman. He and Mrs. Holman began a relationship without Mr. Holman's knowledge.
Miller told police he and Tammy were close, and her husband was becoming concerned. He went on to say Tammy asked him to kill Larry. She wanted it done during hunting season to make it appear as if it was an accident. Miller believed that with Larry dead, he and Tammy would be free to live the life he dreamed of. Miller had tried once and missed. November 21st was his last chance. The final day of hunting season.
Mr. Miller got down to the property about 2 o'clock and actually watched Mr. Holman drive into the field. Miller was up the road a ways and positioned against a tree. And as Mr. Holman started to leave the property, he took the shot. He watched Mr. Holman
violent slump. His head go forward and rest on the steering wheel, and the car veered off.
Police believe he then packed up his rifle, picked up his shell casings, and left the scene. It was then that he made the call to Tammy Holman.
He told her to set one less place at the dinner table.
On January 10, 2001, detectives arrested Tammy Holman for the murder of her husband.
Charlie Miller was basically double-crossed by Mrs. Holman. He thought he was going to get to live the life that Larry Holman lived, and instead she pulls Alan Tripp in, who is now taking over Larry's position in the family. She was a black widow, and she had all these lovers out there, and she kind of used them all to do her dirty work for her.
Charles Miller pled guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 25-year prison sentence. Tammy Holman was sentenced to 7 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. A sniper's bullet will often give him away, but a hitman who uses a more obscure weapon poses an added challenge for police.
Have you ever said this?
Maybe I carried that one maybe a little long.
That's all right, Dr. Gallo. What we're going to do is say, please come back on with a similar update. That covered everything I was actually going to ask, and to Dr. Robert Gallo and all your past experience in one person. Sure, go ahead.
Okay, because I think this will be important. I think within the Global Virus Network right now, and we'll be coming out with this more publicly very soon, in a report that Dr. Chumakov, at the FDA virologist, we think there is something that could really help right now with a vaccine that is a not specific vaccine for this virus, but it's available now, that will have, it could very well have, and I believe will, a major effect for the world. And you'll hear about this very soon. Perhaps the next time we talk.
Okay, you'll please let us know. We'll talk about it next time you come on. Thank you for ending on that hopeful note.
Paying bills online or filling the
911 dispatcher received a frantic call from a woman in Green Cove Springs, Florida.
We'll get somebody out there, okay?
The caller, Linda Jones, reported that 3 men had broken in and ransacked her home. Jones said that she had been tied up. Her husband severely beaten. Deputies from the Clay County Sheriff's Department rushed to the address. On the lookout for 3 intruders, they approached the home with caution.
Glad you guys are here. I was here with your husband.
I just need for you to wait for me. Tell me what's going on.
A deputy secured the living room. The assailants appeared to have fled. Linda's husband, Jack Jones, lay on the floor in a puddle of blood. His hands and feet bound with duct tape. He was not breathing. The deputy began CPR. Distraught and inconsolable, his wife could offer few lucid details. Paramedics rushed onto the scene. As deputies tried to gain a description of the attackers, they did not have much to go on. Linda said the men wore ski masks. The rest was a blur. Lieutenant Tom Waugh was assigned the case.
We were told that 3 masked assailants entered the residence. They had some kind of a club or bat with them, and they had tied up her husband, and literally beat him with this weapon. Then they went through the residence and stole various items, such as money and jewelry.
Paramedics examined Linda Jones. Her injuries seemed minor. She complained of tingling and pain in her left arm and was taken to a local hospital for treatment. Her husband was not as fortunate. Jack Jones was dead.
The crime scene itself was very violent.
We noticed right off the bat a lot of blood. There was blood on the floor, because there was blood spatter on the wall, and it appears that he was drugged into an adjacent room. And on the wall, as he rounded the corner, it looked as if he had his hands on the door corner trying to hold himself back. And then once he was in the other room, that is where he was literally beaten to death.
Pieces of duct tape were scattered throughout the house, along with a partially used roll. Officials believed it had likely been used on the wife. She too had been tied up, she told deputies, but tore herself free before calling police. The reason for the break-in appeared less clear the more detectives looked around. Valuables were found in plain view.
It was made to look like it was ransacked. You know, just disheveled.
Jewelry, an expensive watch, a man's wallet with cash and credit cards were all left behind.
Those are the things that you can turn the fastest. They would have been gone. And why would you leave money? Why would you leave jewelry? Didn't seem right.
At the hospital, deputies took a statement from Linda Jones and fingerprints to help eliminate those found at the house. She claimed her wrists were tied and her mouth sealed shut with duct tape. But something about her story didn't sit right with detectives.
You would have some signs of that. There wasn't any redness on her mouth or her face. That didn't seem quite right, because normally duct tape will leave a residue, or they'll leave a redness when you snatch that thing off.
Police were left with many questions. An autopsy provided few answers. The coroner's report revealed broken ribs, skull fractures, and severe contusions from the knees to the top of his head. Lieutenant Jim Redmond recalls the official findings.
The injuries to Jack Jones were as a result of blunt force trauma. The injuries were indicative of a bat or some type of club.
The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves throughout the community. Detectives were baffled.
The Joneses lived in a nice neighborhood in the Lake Asbury area of Clay County. Why did somebody pick out this house in this affluent neighborhood? Quiet, peaceful, very peaceful, quiet neighborhood. Why did they just pick this house out at random to come in and commit this crime? It just wasn't right.
Investigators hoped Jones's widow might shed some light on the case. Her response, however, surprised them.